So yeah, all of the boys in the comics are on Compound V from the start, so yeah, comics win here, and MM has an insane backstory here. Like I just said, comics win. I'll talk about Huey and Butcher later. We'll use the fight against Stormfront to compare, since in both versions that's been a most difficult fight. So Comics Kamiko lost to Comics Stormfront, but she gouged out one of his eyes. Show Kamiko has help against Stormfront in both encounters, but there's not really much to suggest one is definitively weaker, so I call this even. So in the comics, Black Noir is revealed as Homelander's clone and is the one that ends up killing him, but not unscathed. Up to that point, Homelander is virtually unchallenged. In the show, there have been other supes that can hold their own against him, even though he is still arguably the strongest, except for potentially Ryan. I'll say comics Homelander wins this, since the power gap between Homelander and other relevant supes in the comics is just that much larger than it is in the show. Maeve in the comics loses a fight to Homelander and deals with her no problem. In the show, she fights Homelander and despite losing her eyes, stands her ground against him. You could argue Homelander held back due to somewhat lingering feelings he might have had, but even so, her show version brawls with some of the strongest characters, which kinda gives her the edge over the comics version. I know comics Maeve doesn't really get to show off her abilities much, but there's not really much else I can compare except for comics Maeve having flight. So Show Starlight and Comic Starlight essentially have the same powers, but Comic Starlight really doesn't do much. Most we get of her powers is her temporarily blinding A-Train, and she can control her flight in comparison to Show Starlight, so whilst they could be potentially even, I'll give it to Show Starlight for having some feats to back her up. Like I already said in the comics, he's the clone of the strongest supe, and in the show he gets killed by him. I know Homelander did it suddenly and Noir is powerful, but I still gotta give it to comics. With regards to speed powers, there's no real feats that make it seem like one is much faster than the other. In terms of durability, show version gets his leg easily broken by Kamiko, this was a surprise hit though, and comics version gets tortured by Butcher on V and then killed by Huey on V. In terms of strength, A-Train has actually shown more feats regarding this. I'm giving it to the show, but it's close. So, show version has his water abilities, and the comics version is never shown using these, even though it's presumed he has them. However, comics version does have flight, which a lot of characters in the comics have, and doesn't have the gills weakness the show version does. In terms of strength, show appears stronger. In terms of durability, comics appears stronger. Since the show version needs to be near bodies of water for his major advantage and he has a glaring weakness, I'm going to give it to the comics version. So both Stormfront in the show and comic Stormfront get curb stomped by people with V, but in the show, Stormfront doesn't die from this, she ends up mutilated as a result of Ryan's heat vision, but alive thanks to a healing factor. Now the reason I find it hard to decide a winner is because there's no way to know if Stormfront from the show would have survived the beating she escaped from, which is what killed comic Stormfront. Show Stormfront has a proven healing factor against one of the strongest suit powers, but comic Stormfront's DNA is used to create Homelander, so their strength feats should be similar. I'm calling it even because I can't think of a decisive factor. I mean, the comics version is a normal human, and the show version is one of the most powerful super abilities shown. Show wins. I mean, the comics version showcases pathetic, whereas the show's version is this cool guy that can just go head to head with Homelander since, you know, he's his biological father. The comics version is just outclassed compared to the show's version being one of the most OP characters. Well, I mean, the show version grew up to be a preteen with developing Homeland abilities, whilst the comic version was killed as a baby by Butcher back when he wasn't on V. I'm saying show wins in the darkest sense. Now, as I've said, Comics Huey is on Compound V throughout the story and has the standard super abilities. Comic Huey deals with supes more, but the only notable ones are through additional support, so strength comparison isn't amazing. I wouldn't have much of an argument to make except for the fact that the show version has teleporting powers. I know he gets off the V and loses these powers, but I'm giving it to the show since it is the more powerful version of Huey, even if it is temporary. Now, Comics Butcher has the standard suit powers as well, but Show Butcher on V has laser vision, which was clearly given to him so he could parallel Homelander. He's also got some tendrils going on as a result of his V tumor. I know Comic Butcher is arguably one of the strongest characters, but I'm carrying this as an unknown since we don't know how strong Show Butcher has gone with new powers.